I opened my eyes to a storm of sound and felt my chest slam into my ribs before I even saw her. My mother standing in the doorway with 3 infants hooked to her like weights, eyes wide and wild and pleading. She planted herself there like a blockade and said, "Please, you can't leave, you'll ruin us," her voice trembling so hard it scraped. Hudson was latched to my leg, little fingers clawing denim, and I could feel him shaking. My duffel lay on the bed zipped shut with the campus lease and deposit receipt tucked inside like a promise. For a hot second I froze, like someone had slammed a hand over my mouth, because those tiny bodies pressed to her like a fortress made something in me go numb. I told her I needed time to think, even though my throat was raw and thinking felt impossible, and I eased past her because standing still would have been worse than moving. Hudson came with me to the kitchen, and I started making peanut butter sandwiches with hands that didn't quite obey me, the knife slipping 2 or 3 times. The babies screamed like a chorus from another room, and every shriek felt like it was aiming straight for my head. Mom followed, and I watched her try to juggle 2 in her arms while the third screamed in a bouncer, eyes darting, lips cracked. She said, "I can't do this, I can't." And for the first time since I became a mother at 16, I understood that line, the one where you either fold or you fight. I had to choose a life for Hudson and myself, not for everyone else. I called the campus daycare with my thumb so shaky I almost hit redial twice, and the woman on the other end sounded bored and efficient until she said, "Yes, you're still on the list starting next week." And I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. That call was a little lifeline, thin as thread, but it held. Hudson sniffled against my leg and asked, "Are we moving, Mom?" in a small voice that made my insides curl. I said, "Yes, sweetie. We're going to try," and I meant it the way you mean something when you have no other real options left. The bag on the bed wasn't just fabric and paperwork anymore. It was a doorway I was afraid to cross, but also the only way out. Mom asked why I couldn't stay and help, and I watched her like someone watching a house burn, knowing what was happening but helpless to stop it. "You know I have finals," I told her, trying for calm that felt thin as tissue. She said, "You owe me," and the words hit like an accusation hammered in slow. I wanted to scream back that I didn't owe her a life I hadn't signed up for, that I had a child who needed consistency. But I swallowed it because Hudson was watching, and because anger wouldn't change diaper money or baby formula. I set the plates on the table like I was performing a ritual that would hold us all together for a minute longer. Everything was loud and wrong, the shrill of 3 infants, the rattle of a box of wipes, the clank of the sink. I warmed bottles with hands that kept thinking of formulas and office hours and lecture notes I had to learn. The house looked like someone had given up on it. Spit up on the curtains, laundry crammed in a heap, toys scattered like forgotten promises. I thought of staying for another week or another month, until the scholarship ran out, until the counselor said I needed to focus, until someone else solved the problem for us. But every time I looked at Hudson's face, I saw how small decisions now would shape everything for him later, and that was heavier than any guilt my mother threw at me. I told Mom I couldn't quit school, and she said, "You're just like your father, leaving when things get hard." And I felt something old and filthy crawl under my skin. But I also felt something else, an edge of clarity that cut through the fog. I had to build a life that would let Hudson sleep through the night without waking up to chaos, a life where he had predictable meals and a bed that stayed his. I tightened the strap on my bag like buckling a seatbelt and said, "I love you," to her because sometimes those 3 words were all you had to offer when everything else was falling apart. When Hudson took a bite of sandwich, crumbs dusting his lip, he looked at me with an expression that was mostly trust and a little fear, and that was when I knew I would pick the path forward even if it terrified me. I called the housing office to confirm move-in dates while feeding him and thinking about textbooks and baby wipes. My heart beat like a thing trying to escape my chest, and every plan I made had to be tight and small and honest. Daycare for Hudson, campus housing for us, rotation of shifts at work, a list of numbers for community help. It wasn't heroic. It was survival dressed in practicality, and it was the first real choice I had made for both of us that felt like it might stick. That first night with the triplets home was relentless and felt like a loop that wouldn't stop. They screamed every hour, and the sound dug into my bones until I couldn't think straight. Mom stumbled through the living room between bassinet and couch, her hair a mess and her voice thin when she said, "I can't do this alone." And she kept crying like someone who'd been given a problem too big to carry. I let myself fall asleep for a short while on the kitchen chair because my body finally gave in, and I woke to find her passed out on the couch with a baby pressed against her chest and milk crusted at the corner of his mouth. My hands moved like they had a memory separate from my brain. I changed diapers, warmed bottles, and tried to get them settled enough that I could leave for my shift. By the time I walked in wearing my greeter apron, I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. My legs had that jelly feeling and my eyes stung from not sleeping properly. My manager pulled me into the back room with a look that mixed concern and the kind of business calm that means trouble. She said, "Listen, you're doing a good job, but you're slipping. One more late or distracted shift and I can't keep you." I could hear in her voice that she meant it. She liked me, she said, but liking me didn't pay the bills. I lied and told her I had a handle on things and promised I'd do better. Because promises are cheap and panic is expensive. When I got home, the house was the kind of disaster you don't see in movies. Formula powder dusted the floor like gray snow, empty bottles were stacked in the sink, and there was a mountain of laundry that threatened to swallow the couch. Toys were scattered across the hallway like a child's war zone. Mom stood in the doorway with the phone clutched to her ear, pleading with someone I couldn't see, and when she hung up, she looked at me with a raw, pleading face and begged me to skip school. Finals were a week away, and my scholarship was tied to straight A's. Missing exams would mean losing more than a grade. I told her no because I couldn't trade my future for an uncertain present. She called me selfish, and I heard the word land like a spear.
Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. All right, let's jump back into the story.
Hudson stuck close to me that evening, his small hand inside mine like an anchor. He asked, "Are we gonna be okay?" And I had a million half-answers ready and none of the real ones. I fed him a bottle, counted his breaths as he slept, and watched the triplets fuss like they were trying to rearrange the room with noise. I tried to study for chem problems between diaper changes, scribbling formulas on the back of a grocery receipt while a baby screamed in the next room. My textbooks were stacked in the corner like silent judges, pages waiting for me to prove something to a scholarship committee that didn't know my face. I went to work, clocked in, and stockroom duty felt like a threat to my whole plan. A missed shift could mean missed rent or lost hours, and any slip at school could mean losing the scholarship that made everything possible. I started timing everything like a machine. Feed at 7, study at 8, work from 1 to 6, sleep if I could from 11 to 2, repeat. The schedule didn't leave room for collapsing on the couch or for the way Mom would sometimes stare off like someone lost inside herself. Once, when she opened the fridge and stood there crying, I felt anger flare and then shame follow quick as a shadow. I told her to call someone, anyone, and she said she'd try, but the trying looked thin. Neighbors began to notice the noise. One evening, a woman from down the hall knocked and asked quietly if we needed help, and I wanted to accept and also wanted to protect my privacy like it was a fragile thing. The money I had was tight. I counted every dollar like prayer beads and decided to put gas money in before buying anything else, because without gas, I couldn't get to work or to campus. I learned fast that help doesn't come all at once. It trickles, it arrives in casseroles and coupons, and a woman from the church who left a pile of diapers on the stoop late at night. Back home, the triplets' cries made everything urgent. The house smelled like formula and detergent and the faint memory of better times. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop in front of me and tried to write an English paper while a baby wailed 2 rooms over. The words felt heavy and my sentences kept falling apart. I handed in the paper at midnight with 2 hours of sleep and a bottle still warm in my bag. Turning it in felt like throwing a message in a bottle into a storm and hoping someone would read it and care. Mom oscillated between moments of clarity and blankness. Sometimes she'd try to help with a bottle and do it right, rocking a baby until he settled, and other times she'd lock herself in the bathroom and sob until her whole body shook. I thought about staying home to hold everything together, but I also thought about the promise of the campus room, about Hudson having a quiet night, and about what it meant to choose a life where I could eventually build more stability. Saying no to my mother felt like betrayal and bravery at the same time. I kept moving because standing still would have been worse, and because small choices, a skipped night out, a morning in the library, would shape our future. Hudson started changing in ways that made my stomach drop. He had accidents at night, clung to me like I was the only thing keeping him safe, and woke up screaming from nightmares. His teacher pulled me aside one afternoon after class and asked, "Has something changed at home?" And I lied a little and said nothing serious, which felt like a betrayal and the only option at once. I took him to the park that afternoon because the air calmed him and because I needed to see him breathe without panic. A neighbor, Linda, sat on a bench and said, "I've been worried. The crying from your place is nonstop." And she looked at me like she was trying to offer rescue without knowing how. I told Linda thank you and didn't tell her everything. I watched Hudson climb the slide and felt a twist inside me that was part guilt, part urgency. I thought about how small he was and what his brain would mark as normal if this kept up. Late nights, random people, a mother who was sometimes there and sometimes not. After the park, we walked home slowly, me holding his hand so tight my knuckles hurt, trying to plan the next move like it was a complicated recipe. I promised myself I would make things predictable for him, even if that meant borrowing courage I didn't have yet. A few days later in chemistry review, my phone buzzed like a metronome and then like an alarm. Mom had left a string of frantic messages. "He's been crying for 3 hours, he has a fever, I can't get them all in the van, I can't do it." The voice quivered and hit me in the chest like a physical blow. I shut my notebook, stood up fast, and walked out of lecture with my heart racing so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't stop to ask permission or to plan beyond the next breath. I ran to my car, drove like a person with a deadline they made themselves, and planned to load them in shifts because the backseat was small and my old sedan didn't offer more than one car seat space at once. Getting them out of the house took a minute that stretched to an hour. One by one, I sat on the pavement and buckled a wailing infant into a car seat, then ran back for the next, making a rhythm out of panic. Hudson watched from the front window with big eyes and mouthed, "Be careful, Mom," and my throat tightened, because being careful felt like a job description I was still learning. I drove to the pediatrician with the radio off and the baby's cries filling the car like a chorus that wouldn't stop. The doctor listened and checked, and then said reflux, in the soft way doctors say things that cost money. Reflux meant special formula that our budget didn't cover. The word, expensive, sat on the exam table between me and the pediatrician like an accusation. A nurse, who moved with practical kindness, slipped a couple of sample cans into my bag and explained the WIC program in a way that made it sound usable if we applied fast. She wrote down phone numbers and talked me through how to keep feeding smaller and burp more often. I let myself cry for a minute in the stairwell outside the office because crying felt like releasing steam, and then I held myself together to drive to work. I went to my shift at the grocery store after the pedi appointment and walked in like I had been trained to act like everything was fine. Inside, I felt like glass. That night, I warmed bottles in the break room of my tiny apartment and wrote most of my English paper in fits between feedings, the glow of my laptop, and the hum of the heating unit keeping me awake. It felt like performing multiple full-time jobs at once: student, parent, nurse, mediator, financial planner. I typed sentences with one hand and rocked a baby with the other, tasting formula on my lip and tasting exhaustion in the back of my throat. At midnight, the house smelled like warm bottles and detergent, and I passed the pediatric nurse's tips to Mom like a script so she could follow steps and feel some control. She listened, eyes wet but steadier than before, and I saw for the first time in weeks a small beam of something like hope. We measured feedings, followed burp schedules, and tried to map a routine onto chaos. The sample cans helped for a week and the WIC appointment was scheduled, but everything still felt fragile. One missed paycheck, one missed application, one burned-out babysitter, and the whole system could shatter. I learned how to budget fast. I canceled things that felt optional and drew up a list of priorities with neat, mean lines. Formula, rent, bus fare, utilities, subscriptions cut. I traded shifts with coworkers and borrowed textbooks from students who'd already finished the semester. Hudson started to sleep a little better when his nights felt quieter, and the triplets' screaming eased with the new formula and burp routine. It wasn't a cure, and the financial pressure was still there, heavy as a stone, but the immediate emergency had shifted to a list of problems we could tackle one by one. I fell into bed around 3 in the morning exhausted and strangely relieved, because for the first time in a long stretch of chaos, we had a plan that included steps and numbers and a nurse's name I could call. The knock at the door felt like the loudest thing in the world because the house was already loud with crying and dishes clanking, and when I opened it, a woman in a county car stepped onto the porch and said, "Hi, I'm from Child Protective Services," like she was reading off a script that should have made everything better. She walked through the house with a steady, slow look, opened cabinets, peered into the bassinet, and then sat down at our kitchen table with a clipboard as if deciding whether to sign a sentence. Mom sat across from her, and I sat on the edge of a chair holding Hudson in my lap, listening to the questions like they should be simple, but they weren't. The social worker said plainly, "We're here because neighbors called about ongoing risk. We need to make sure the kids are safe." And I felt my stomach drop in that particular hollow way that only real fear makes. She toured the disaster as if she had seen 1,000 rooms like ours, and her face didn't change much, which made it worse. The living room, the bottles, the pile of laundry, everything was on display and I couldn't hide a single thing. She interviewed Mom first, then me, asking about sleep patterns, feeding, who helps, and whether there were plans if something worse happened. At one point, she looked at me and said, "If you were to take over full-time care, the court might consider formalizing guardianship to protect the children." And that legal word landed heavy in the room, both an option and a threat. I hadn't thought about custody language in terms of law. I had thought about safety and routine and whether my scholarship could survive a courtroom. They put a safety plan in place that read like a checklist for keeping our family in the house and out of courtrooms: parenting classes, therapy for Mom, weekly check-ins from CPS, and a list of local services to contact in an emergency. The social worker handed us the list and said, "These steps are about support, not punishment. Follow them and we can keep referrals minimal." I signed forms because the options were to say no and risk removal or say yes and get help. Mom agreed to attend parenting classes, and to my surprise and relief, she actually showed up. For the first time in months, she opened the handouts and read them like someone learning how to breathe again. It wasn't perfect, and she stumbled through the first class like a beginner, but she came back the next week and the next, notebook under her arm. I set boundaries then because the plan forced my hand and my head cleared enough to make rules that would keep me studying. I told Mom I would help specific nights only, Tuesdays and Thursdays and weekends for babysitting, and that I would not be the full-time caregiver. She called me heartless that first night after I said no to an extra shift at the grocery store, and her voice shook when she said, "How can you just leave your own mother?" I said, "Because I have to keep Hudson stable. I can't give up school or his future." And the words came out firm in a way I hadn't expected. Saying it felt like closing a door I didn't want to slam but had to. I stuck to the boundary even when she cried and told anyone who would listen that I was selfish. I learned that mercy without limits can become a prison. A quiet volunteer from a different church started leaving meals on our porch anonymously, and the first cooler of lasagna showed up like proof someone else was out there watching. I left a note that said thank you and never got a reply, but the food lasted and the weight in my chest eased for a few nights. The regular deliveries became a small safety net: casseroles, diapers, and once a stack of store gift cards tucked under a pan of brownies. Those anonymous hands doing work without judgment made it easier to focus on homework and hospital visits and parenting classes. Mom began antidepressants and showed up for therapy the way someone shows up for a job, some days dedicated, some days dragging, but overall she kept going, which mattered more than the pace. At first, the weekly CPS check-ins felt invasive like bright lights in private rooms, but as we demonstrated steps taken, attending classes, the pediatrician's notes about the triplets, proof of formula purchases, the visits changed tone. Cheyenne, the social worker, shifted from hard questions to practical help, suggesting a local support group and helping us apply for WIC to secure formula supply consistently. Weeks passed, and the checks reduced to bi-weekly, and then monthly as the house grew cleaner in small, stubborn ways, and the bottles became less strewn. The plan didn't fix everything overnight, but it created a map. It named what we needed and set timelines that made problems feel manageable instead of endless. I kept studying in borrowed hours, Mom went to therapy and took her meds, and the anonymous church volunteer kept leaving meals like gentle reminders that people sometimes help without needing credit. Life became a sequence of small moves: class, work, a parenting session, a check-in, a nap if we were lucky. Those moves added up into something steadier, less dramatic perhaps, but real, and I felt like I could breathe a little deeper each week, knowing the case would wind down if we kept walking the path. Mom found the receipt one night tucked under a pile of junk mail. Murphy's Bar, January 12th, a timestamp and a charge that didn't belong. I stared at it like it might rearrange itself into an apology, and then I took a deep breath and started asking around. The bar had a check-in list. A name kept coming up, Conrad Goodman, and when I finally tracked him down, he was the kind of man who looked careful about his life, married, with a steady job, or at least that's what people said. I called him, he sounded surprised to hear my voice and said, "I don't know what you're talking about," like denial could erase the receipt. That didn't fly with me. I went to him in person because sometimes phones make courage harder to find. He shifted in his chair when I said, "You need to do a DNA test for the kids," and he tried to smooth things over with small talk and excuses. I told him I could go legal if I had to, and the way his face changed when I mentioned court made him stop smiling. "All right," he said finally, voice low. "I'll do the test." Making him agree felt like pulling at a loose thread and hoping the sweater would come apart the right way. While the paperwork moved slowly and the tests were ordered, life didn't pause. One night I was called to the hospital because one triplet was breathing fast and turning dusky. The doctor said RSV and put a little oxygen mask over his nose. I sat in a plastic chair under a harsh hospital light that never quieted down and kept a hand on his back while nurses jotted notes. I studied my government notes in the dim between feedings and alarms, trying to remember what I'd read about rights and responsibilities while a monitor clicked beside us. I dozed sometimes, woke to the baby coughing, and then slept again with my head on my backpack because there was nothing else to do. I slept in those chairs in shifts with other parents who smelled of sleep and worry, and I learned how your body folds around a crisis and makes room. When the night nurse took over, I left the baby with a trusted tech and drove to campus like a ghost, heart a drum, to sit my final. I walked into the exam room minutes before it started, pencil in hand, and somehow answered questions with the same hands that had been wiping noses and holding bottles hours before. After the test, I drove straight back to the hospital, handed the exam in online while sitting in the waiting room, and felt like I was living two lives at once. Student and on-call parent, neither one slowing down. Then the test results came back. Conrad's DNA matched all three triplets. He called after the clinic called him, voice thin and surprised. His wife, his legal spouse, found out and left him soon after, packing a suitcase and a lifetime of patience into a car. Conrad promised money to avoid a court fight. He offered a modest monthly payment and said he'd help with some care visits. "I'll do what I can," he told me over the phone, as if that covered everything. It helped for sure, and the first check that arrived paid for a month of special formula and some overdue bills, but reality had a long tail. Medical bills, formula costs, and the everyday grind still swallowed most of it. CPS wanted me to document everything so the caseworker could see the flow of support. I printed emails, saved texts, and banked copies of checks so the paper trail matched the story we were telling. Conrad's agreement kept us out of court that season, but the money was a bandage on a larger wound. I learned to stretch it. Coupons, bulk buying when prices dropped, and talking to the clinic about sliding scale payments. I rearranged my work shifts when possible and leaned on the student parents group for swaps and babysitting trades. The small network we built meant the triplets got to keep going to their pediatric follow-ups, and Hudson had a sitter when school demanded it. Through all that, I kept reminding myself of what I was trying to protect: Hudson's chance at a steady life, the triplets' health, and my ability to finish school. The emergency taught me to move fast and to ask for help without shame. Conrad's tests answered a question we needed answered, but they didn't fix the house, the bills, or the nights of no sleep. They did, however, change the ledger slightly, and sometimes that's enough to keep you afloat until the tide turns. I went to class, worked the grocery store, sat in one more parenting class, and learned how to keep a calendar like a lifeline. Each small step felt like progress, even when the pile of problems still loomed large. Slow improvements started showing up like small lights in a dark room, one at a time, until the room wasn't pitch black anymore. Mom found an online multiples group and began reading posts late at night, learning feeding schedules and stretch-out tricks from women who had been through this exact storm. She began timing feeds so the babies would nap together, and when they finally slept at the same time for an hour or two, it felt like a miracle. Those naps became the little windows where she could shower, eat, or simply sit without feeling a hand tug at her sleeve every minute. Conrad stepped up a little more after the tax return and a few stern conversations with his lawyer, and I watched the way the money showed up in our account like a cautious tide. He increased his monthly payment, not a fortune, but enough that Mom could hire a college-aged helper for 10 hours a week. That helper was a lifesaver. She came on weekdays, changed diapers, sat with the babies while Mom took a nap, and even folded laundry without being asked. Mom could shower without the fear of a shriek slicing the water's warmth, and she started to look like the person she used to be, if only for a few hours each day. We applied for subsidized daycare because everything felt like math now: income, hours, sleep, study time. The approval came through for when the babies turned 8 months, and it cut Mom's childcare costs drastically, changing our monthly budget into something we could live inside. The relief wasn't instant, but it was steady, the kind you feel in your jaw when you stop clenching. Mom spent time learning how to enroll them, what documents to bring, and how to interview daycare providers so the babies would have consistent caregivers who could follow the routines she'd set. I moved Hudson into our campus apartment, a small 2-bedroom that looked tiny on the lease but held a lot of promise. We had a little playground right outside, with a swing that became his favorite place to blow off steam and laugh. The apartment felt like a safe bubble where he could sleep through the night again and where I could lock the door on the noise of the old house. I unpacked our life into the tiny kitchen and the smaller bedroom and reminded myself that size didn't always equal safety. Routine did. Joining the Student Parents Network turned out to be one of the smartest things I did. The group taught me about emergency childcare swaps, where parents traded nap hours like currency, and about tutoring resources for toddlers who needed help catching up. I met other students who juggled finals and bottles, and we traded schedules, babysitting favors, and textbook PDFs. A woman named Lisa showed me how to set up a backup plan if Mom couldn't make one of her days, offering phone numbers of neighborhood sitters who would take a child for a few hours when class clashed with an appointment. Having structure around the week let me keep my grades while helping on the scheduled nights we agreed on. I kept my Tuesday and Thursday evenings free for laundry and bottles and weekend mornings for extra hours with the babies, and those blocks were precise and enforced. Mom knew the plan and used her helper hours for rest and therapy, which made a real difference in how she showed up when I arrived to help. The routine meant I could say yes when I wanted to and no when I needed to study, and that boundary kept me from crumbling under the weight of everything. School still demanded late nights and early mornings, but those late hours had purpose. I studied for finals in the campus lounge while Hudson played under a watchful babysitter, and I knew that the tutoring options from the Student Parents Network could help him if he lagged behind. The tiny, regular wins added up. A paid bill, an extra hour of sleep, a cleared assignment, a playdate that didn't end in tears. We celebrated them quietly, like people who have learned to value small victories. Mom's mood improved slowly with therapy and meds, and she began to smile in ways that held more than a minute. She learned to trust routines and to ask for help before she broke. Conrad's payments didn't cover everything, but combined with WIC, subsidized daycare, and the anonymous meal deliveries that kept coming sometimes, the math began to work. The triplets hit milestones. They started crawling and then pulling up, and their little faces smoothed into something that wasn't always desperate. I still kept an eye on the calendar like a lifeline, planning study blocks around feed times, and I still felt the tug of guilt when I left the house without doing more. But the structure we built meant Hudson could go to bed without being jarred awake, and the triplets had steady naps and a caregiver who knew their cues. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't over, but the slow improvements layered into something that looked a lot like stability, small, stubborn, and earned one day at a time. CPS closed the case and said it would be on a voluntary services basis, which felt like someone letting go of one hand and keeping the other. I still saw Cheyenne once a month for a while, just to check the boxes and show progress, and those meetings felt less like inspections and more like proof we were moving. Mom kept going to therapy and took her meds like she was following a new recipe for breathing. Some days were better than others, but she kept going. Sean, the church volunteer, organized a meal train and laundry help so there were nights when dinner appeared on the porch and clean sheets were folded into the basket. And that small kindness kept the house from tipping back into chaos. A student helper we hired came by every week for 10 hours, and she became part of the rhythm, changing diapers, playing peekaboo, and giving Mom a little time to shower or nap. She was young and steady and learned the baby's cues fast, and when she was there the house had a different sound. Less frantic, more like breathing. The triplets began to hit milestones in ways that felt almost unbelievable after those rough first months. I remember the first time one of them held his head up strong enough to look me straight in the face, like he was seeing me as a real person who mattered, not just a set of arms. They learned to grasp toys and later sit with help, and then sit alone, and when the first crawled, I felt the floor under my knees like holy ground because it meant forward movement. Watching them pull themselves up and cruise, the couch felt like watching a slow, bright repair happen where there'd been so much broken. Hudson changed the most in front of my eyes once we moved him into the campus apartment and he had his own room. He stopped waking up in the middle of the night because of noise. He began sleeping through stretches that made both my heart and my brain quieter. His daycare teachers started to say things like, "He's doing so much better," and "He's making great progress," and I would blink hard to keep tears from coming when I heard it. I found a job at the campus library that was the perfect fit because it let me study during slow hours and keep a steady schedule that matched my classes and the kids' care. Working there meant I could stay near my books between shelving shifts and earn a steady few hours of pay that made the budget less scary. I learned how to bookmark free study time and to balance shift swaps with the Student Parents Network when something urgent came up. The job also gave me a quiet place to write papers and a steady rhythm that felt like a backbone for everything else. Mom wrote me a letter one night and slid it under my bedroom door like a fragile treaty. In the letter, she admitted she'd been cruel and that she knew asking me to sacrifice everything wasn't fair. It wasn't a grand apology or a full fixing of the past, but it was honest, and it acknowledged that I had to leave to protect my child and my education. I read it with the lamp low and felt a weight shift in my chest because the truth on paper was better than the old defenses that had kept us trapped. We didn't make big speeches that night. We started Sunday visits instead, a routine where I came back with Hudson to help with baths and bottle prep. It wasn't perfect, but it was a pattern that let both of us rebuild on terms that didn't crush me. Sean kept coordinating people who came to help with laundry and meals, and sometimes he'd bring groceries in person and stand awkwardly until Mom hugged him and said thank you. The meal train continued, and sometimes a cooler showed up with food and another time with diapers or wipes. These things sound small, but they were the difference between skipping bills and keeping the lights on. The childcare rotation we set up with the student helper and substitutes from the parents' group meant Mom could attend therapy, and 2 times a week she could nap long enough that she woke up cleaner and quieter. That stability made her more available to learn and to practice the skills she got in parenting classes. The triplets reached more milestones, babbling, sitting, and then crawling, and each one felt like a little victory we could hang on the wall. Hudson's teachers sent notes about his reading and social growth, and sometimes they'd call to say he was kind to another child or that he had the best dinosaur collection in class, and my chest would swell with relief and pride. I kept the schedule tight: study blocks at the library job, help night on Tuesdays, childcare rotation on weekends, and Sunday visits for family time. The routine wasn't glamorous, but it was a frame that held our lives steady. We learned to ask for help and, more importantly, to accept it. Support systems held us up in practical ways and in quieter ones: an anonymous casserole that saved dinner, a check that covered a month's formula, a student helper who stayed when she could have gone home. Those things didn't fix everything, but they let us sleep a little more and breathe a little more, and in the spaces that open up, people like Mom and I started finding room to heal and to plan for what came next. Move day felt like a bruise and a balm at the same time. I packed Hudson's things with the help of neighbors who showed up like a small army, hauling boxes and folding blankets into my car while I tried not to lose it. One neighbor, Maria, folded Hudson's tiny sweatshirt and said, "He's going to love that playground," like it was simple truth, and I wanted to believe it with everything in me. Mom stood on the porch with 2 of the triplets wrapped to her chest, rocking them gently as if she could keep the whole house in her arms. She hugged us hard, whispered, "Drive safe and call me," and watched us pull away with eyes full of something I couldn't name right then. The campus apartment felt small and honest, a place where doors closed without the echo of 100 problems. Daycare slots were confirmed for Hudson, and there was a plan for the triplets once they rolled into their subsidized care at 8 months. I met other student parents in the elevator who nodded like we shared a secret and handed me numbers for emergency swaps if a sitter fell through. "Text me," one classmate said when I mentioned a late seminar, and that simple line meant a sitter, not panic. Tutoring options were already in place for little ones who needed help with early reading, and I found myself breathing right for the first time in months because schedules actually matched. Mom found a part-time job once the daycare started for the babies, something that fit between naps and therapy appointments, and she came home tired but steadier. Conrad increased his payments a bit more after the tax season and some nudging from the caseworker, and that change let Mom pay the college helper for a few extra hours so she could sleep long enough to get deep rest. Sean from the church kept organizing weekly meals and laundry runs like clockwork, and those casseroles and clean sheets kept the house from slipping back into chaos. The community we'd stumbled into did the heavy lifting sometimes, in quiet, steady ways that didn't ask for a medal. The triplets hitting milestones felt like small explosions of joy after months of frantic survival. The first time one of them crawled across the rug and grabbed for a toy, I laughed like a fool and scooped him up like he was a prize. They learned to sit without support and then to pull themselves to standing, and every tiny win unwrapped a little more of the fear that had been wrapped around us. Hudson did better than I could have hoped. With his own room and a predictable daycare routine, his nightmares faded, he stopped wetting the bed, and his teachers sent home notes about him reading new words and playing with others kindly. Watching him thrive was proof that my choices mattered. I picked up a job at the campus library that worked with my schedule and kept me close to study hours, and slowly my grades caught up with the rest of my life. The semester ended, and I made the dean's list: short sentence, long meaning, proof that I could keep school and parenting both alive without wrecking either. I still remember staring at that email, refusing to let the word Deans mean more than survival had cost. It was a quiet victory that felt like the first steady step after stumbling for months. It wasn't clean. Nights still came when a baby woke screaming and I ran across a courtyard with one in my arms while Hudson clung to my leg, but those moments were fewer and less paralyzing than before. Bills still needed sorting. Conrad's payments never covered everything, and sometimes the washer broke or the helper couldn't come. But boundaries I set. Tuesdays and Thursdays are my help nights. Sunday visits only, study time blocked out, kept me from being swallowed. Saying no became part of the work, not a sign of failure, but a tool for surviving and building. Outside help made the difference. WIC and subsidized daycare lowered the monthly burn, the church volunteers kept meals coming, and the student parents group traded emergency childcare like currency. The college helper gave mom hours to sleep and shower, and therapy plus meds made her more present. Those pieces combined into a grid that held up when something heavy landed on us. The grid wasn't pretty, but it was getting sturdier. I learned to ask for help, to accept it, and to schedule it the way I scheduled homework and shifts. We rebuilt routines, bath time on Sundays, homework in the library, rotation childcare on weekends, and in those routines the family slowly rewired what it felt like to be safe. Mom wrote me more notes, and sometimes she left a casserole with a sticky note that said, "Sorry, love you," small offerings that mattered. The triplets babbled and crawled and then pulled up to the couch, and Hudson's laughter around the playground became the sound I chased home for. It had been messy, painful, and slow, but with limits, help from others, and careful choices, we carved out a life that finally began to heal in a way I could point to and say, "We made it here together."
Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.